The sky over Lake Okeechobee was deceptively calm on the morning of September 16, 1928. Families tending their fields and homes might have noticed the air felt heavier than usual, thick with the kind of tension only nature understands. For days, the news had murmured about a powerful storm churning in the Atlantic. But this was Florida, and storms were as much a part of life as the sprawling groves and sugarcane fields. Few could imagine the destruction that would arrive that evening, or the tragedy it would leave behind. By mid-afternoon, the first signs of trouble appeared. The wind began to howl, tugging at trees and sending debris skittering across dirt roads. As the hours passed, the hurricane arrived in full force, a wall of shrieking wind and pounding rain that battered everything in its path. Palm Beach bore the brunt of the initial landfall, with winds reaching 145 miles per hour. Roofs peeled away, buildings crumbled, and waves smashed into the shore with relentless fury. Yet the storm's true devastation was still miles away. The low-lying communities surrounding Lake Okeechobee were built on fertile land reclaimed from the lake by a makeshift dike. This earthen barrier, hastily constructed after flooding in 1926, was their only defense. Sometime after midnight, it happened. Initially, the storm's counterclockwise rotation pushed the lake's water northward, but as the hurricane passed to the west, the wind shifted, driving the water back southward with immense power. A wall of water, over 20 feet high in some places, decimated the earthen berm. The water burst through the berm and surged across the low-lying farmland. Entire towns, Belle Glade, South Bay, Pahokee, were swallowed by the flood. Homes were lifted off their foundations and carried away. People clung to trees, rooftops, and anything that floated, their cries lost in the roar of the storm. Families huddled together in attics, only to have the rising water force them higher until there was nowhere left to go. Some were swept away, their bodies later found miles from their homes. The storm raged for hours, but for the survivors, it felt like days. When dawn finally broke, a surreal silence fell over the region. The water was still, but the devastation was absolute. Entire towns were gone, replaced by a flat gray expanse of mud and debris. The scale of the disaster was staggering. The bodies of the storm's victims, men, women, and children, littered the landscape. Official estimates of the death toll ranged from 2,500 to 3,000, though many believed the true number was higher. The majority of those who perished were African American and Caribbean migrant workers, living in poorly constructed housing close to the lake. Their communities had been the hardest hit, and their losses were the least acknowledged. In the days that followed, recovery efforts began, but they were grim and chaotic. Bodies were pulled from the mud, sometimes buried in mass graves or burned to prevent disease. The racial inequities of the era were starkly evident. White victims received proper funerals, while Black and Caribbean victims were often treated as afterthoughts. The economic toll was equally devastating. The fertile farmland around the lake was ruined, and the region's agricultural economy came to a standstill. Thousands were left homeless, their livelihoods washed away with the floodwaters. Out of the tragedy came a resolve to prevent such a disaster from happening again. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers undertook a massive project to fortify the dike system around Lake Okeechobee. The Herbert Hoover Dike, completed in the 1930s, became a symbol of resilience and progress, though its construction came too late for the thousands lost in 1928. The storm also exposed systemic flaws in disaster preparedness and racial inequities that would take decades to address. It wasn't until 2003 that a historical marker was placed in West Palm Beach, honoring the unidentified victims buried in mass graves. The 1928 Okeechobee Hurricane remains one of the most devastating natural disasters in U.S. history, its impact etched into the memory of Florida's landscape and its people. It is a story of lives lost and lessons learned, a reminder of nature's power and humanity's resilience.